This is The Micro Effect.
The Micro Effect. www.themicroeffect.com.
You take the blue pill. The story ends. You wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to believe. You take the red pill. You stay in Wonderland. And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
There was a mighty nation, blessed above all of creation. It was a rare and precious pearl, conceived in faith and liberty, home of the brave, land of the free. It was the envy of the world. But this shining city on a hill has turned from the Creator's will and let evil take control. Now the reckless men who lead them want to strip away their freedom and to steal their very soul. Now it's smoke and mirrors, switching bait, criticize and confiscate and let the guilty walk away. In this once righteous, godly nation, in the halls of education, they forbid a child to pray. They say we need to spread the wealth. They pretend to guard the health of the feeble and the poor, while the hand they hold behind their backs confuses and conceals the fact that the wolf is at the door.
Well, welcome to Connecting the Dots. It's Tuesday morning, and it is September 4th. Man, the summer has flown by quickly. We just got through the Labor Day weekend, and we are looking at a tremendous program today on the New World Order. As the listeners know, we've been working on an expose of the deep state and what is exactly behind that deep state. And that's been going on now for about the last 2 months, and very intently for the last 5 or 6 weeks. So we are at the point now where we want to talk about why the New World Order wants to end local elected government, and that's the theme for today. And I have two terrific people who are good friends as well as being people I absolutely admire as great patriots in this country. Michael Shaw is an attorney from California who has been fighting ABAG and the San Francisco area consolidation of governments under their plan, which is the Bay Area government. And that is a program that he's actually been, he's filed some lawsuits, and we'll hear about that today. And with him is his friend and mine, and someone who we all know very well on this program, Debbie Boscalupi. Debbie is a standout in the fight against UN Agenda 21 and has been working with Michael Shaw and myself for years, trying to expose the New World Order and what the UN Agenda 21 program really involves and what it really means to America. So with that, I will start the discussion with the statement that the New World Order is all about ending local elected government and creating a system of government based on the communist, Marxist, socialist model that is what is at the center of the United Nations, and it is based on the false premise of environmentalism as a tool to make sure that program proceeds. And they intend to destroy our representative Republican form of government in the United States of America and make us no more than one more cog in the giant wheel called the New World Order, which will be living under a totalitarian, Marxist, socialist, communist state. So, with that, Michael, welcome to the show, and Debbie, welcome to the show.
Nice to be here, Dan.
I am excited about this program because we've been talking about the deep state. I've had Bill Jasper and John McManus on talking about the deep state. We've got next week I've got two gentlemen who are coming on that are actually part of the national security apparatus that will be talking about it. This is an important program because we are watching the consolidation through regionalism and many other things of our government into something that our founders never intended. And Debbie called me last week and told me about her monitoring of the Western Governors Conference and some of the conversation that came out of that meeting, and it was all about regionalism. It was all about replacing elective government with councils of government, which is something, Michael, that you've been pounding on for a very long time. Debbie, would you kind of tell our listeners what you heard when you were following this governor's conference?
Yeah, so thanks, Dan. I have not only been following what the Western Governors Association has been doing, and this has been a result of some meetings that I was having with Michael Shaw and Pat Wood and Rosa Corey, Heather Gass, and watching the Wildlands Project and the former Dr. Michael Kaufman, God rest his soul, watching how there was this encroachment of land and land use as we were preparing for a conference, one-day conference that we had on Treasure Island. I think, Michael, it was on May 13th. May 3rd. I can't remember the year. It seems so long ago, but it was we were trying to wake people up as to what was happening in the Bay Area, the One Bay Area Plan 2040, which, as you mentioned, is a regional plan where the city and county and eventually the state borders start to disappear. That is what regionalism is, and Michael will go further into that. He is the expert on that area. But watching the Western Governors Association meeting, I found what was called at that time the Crucial Habitat Assessment Tool, the chat map, which they were responsible for in creating. So, they've turned it over to another group. I can't remember the name of the group. But when you look at this map, you see it was much like Dr. Kaufman's Wildland Project map, where most of the western United States was red meaning little to no human use, based on biodiversity, based on the United Nations Biodiversity Conference that George Herbert Walker Bush gave money to when he was president in the early 1990s. But that's when I started to say, whoa, Dan, our Western governors are all for this project, this Wildlands Project map. And so fast forward, I went to a couple of the conferences, and over the years, I've noticed that at these conferences, the governors used to be very hands-on. You could go up and talk to them. In fact, Butch Otter was calling me by name at the end of one conference. He'd say, "Hey, Debbie, what are you up to?" But the most recent conference I went to with Jim Beers last year after the Red Tail Expo up in Whitefish, Montana, it was like hands off, and the people were separated from the governors. There was no really hands-on unless you paid extra money to go to one of their private dinners, unless you were a lobbyist. But since then, so I've seen this distancing, and then recently, having seen Lavoy Finicum, the documentary about Lavoy Finicum, where he mentions cooperating agencies in one of his YouTube videos, and then researching it as a result of Center for Self-Governance, saying, "Debbie, you've got to watch for this. You've got to watch this thing." we are dual federalists. Our founding fathers were dual federalists. They believed in state power. They didn't believe in nationalizing everything and having everything centralized. They believed in separation of power. But as you see, the Western Governors Association, Scott Pruitt, former EPA director, Ryan Zinke, current Secretary of the Interior, they all talk about cooperative federalism, collaborative federalism, which is another name for regionalism. And the most recent, I'll just end it here, Dan, the most recent webinar that I watched, or heard rather, was about cooperative agencies, cooperative federalism when it comes to everything from clean water to air to mostly land use, range cattle, rangeland, and how do we get everybody on board on saving planet Earth? And although they did not say that, that is their intended goal, is, or the ruse is, to save planet Earth from human beings. And how do we do that? We all have to cooperate and come to consensus. They even use the word consensus. So to me, it is a frightening concept. However, it is not a new concept. Even Daniel Webster back in the 1800s wrote about federalism and the fear that he had of what government would do, and that is we would eventually be duped by by designing men if we were not careful and held the power close to the people. And to me, it's frightening that we are now at this place where people are collaborating. So in other words, it makes it look good. Oh yeah, the tribes are on board and the state government is on board and the federal government agencies are on board. Well, what about the landowner that says, wait a minute, that's my property? That endangered species was never here before and it's introduced. And now you all think that, my property should be put up for some biodiversity haven? Anyway.
Yeah. Well, I have to tell you, Debbie, Margaret Haig Byfield is a outspoken proponent of the coordination. And coordination, which is much different than cooperative agency or consultation, coordination under the Federal Land Policy Management Act was introduced so that county commissioners and local folks could have a seat at the table as equals with federal agencies, and it was also intended to deal with state agencies as equals on land matters that affected those citizens in those counties. And as a county commissioner, I brought Margaret to Montana on several different occasions to talk about coordination, and we actually introduced a coordination bill. I was voted by the MACO organization. Now, I'm not talking the parent organization. I'm talking about the county commissioners, to introduce a bill in the legislature, which we did, and guess what? Who was the number one opponent of that coordination bill was MACO, the Montana Association of Counties. Even though we had voted unanimously at our state convention to introduce and get that bill through the legislature, which would increase the ability of county commissioners to deal on land use matters on an equal footing. And that was something, I'm just going to tell you, MACO is one of the most socialist organizations I've ever seen. And the thought of actually making county commissioners attend meetings and stand up for the citizens was totally appalling to MACO. And they fought us, and we ultimately ended up not being able to get that bill through the state legislature. So anyway, I guess I need to mention the fact that there's a huge difference between coordination and cooperative agency and consultation. Coordination is on an equal footing. Consultation and cooperative agency are both that you get to sit there and listen to what plans they have, and they make you feel warm and fuzzy by including you, but you have really no voice in the conversation about what they do on land use planning and policies. So, Michael, you've been very actively involved with ABAG in the Bay Area, and you know all about this regionalism. Let's get you into the conversation, because I really want to hear what you think about these new plans that the Western Governors Association are pushing forward.
Well, Dan, it seems to me that both these tracks, coordination or cooperation, are on the wrong footing, because the footing here, the federal government, is really a toothless animal. The federal government is ruled by Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, and that limits what the federal government can do. It has a list of less than 20 items the federal government can engage in. Well, one, of course, is to declare war. But the federal government is stripped of powers affecting lands. The only land management control it has is over forts and the like for military purposes. That's a very limited amount of land in the United States. And the rest of the land is up to the management of states. So whatever program is being adopted for federal direction of environmental concerns on land masses is totally misplaced in the United States Constitution. It's something that's only heading America down a path to trouble. And the biggest concern I have in that whole regard is that Donald Trump is no hero when it comes to these issues. Trump's brilliance comes with his trade policy, although I think he's not necessarily on his own track with regard to trade policy. When it comes to land management policy, Donald Trump has been nowhere on the issues that are faced by real America in defending their land against federal intrusion. So, my concept is that regional objectives undertaken through cooperative plans is that the federal government is entirely misplaced in this area. That's something that ought to be rejected, and it's disappointing that none of the governors are standing for state rights in this area. This is the essence of state authority, is land and land management. I go so far as to say there's no reason the federal government own Yosemite. Yosemite ought to be a state park, not a federal park. It was Theodore Roosevelt, who put us on this ugly path toward state monuments, national monuments on state lands. It makes no sense to me, and I think it's the root of many of America's problems, and certainly the root of what drives us toward a world government, which now, in modern days, in contemporary 2018 days, I'd say that world government is finally morphing itself into what Orwell predicted, that is, a series of three continental unions battling each other, reducing population until world government that totally stifles human population arises. And I think that's what we see happening now as the North American Union seems to be putting back in place, and we're moving toward the renewal of the North American Union. We're now negotiating with the European Union on trade policy, and we've completely withdrawn from any trade activities in the with Asian countries. And so that to me looks like it sets up the three world continental battles that occur in Orwell's 1984. And, it seems to me that Donald Trump is the man behind that version of globalism with his federalism policies. And that causes me great angst, because the original globalists were all of the mind that world government would not be established until continental unions and battles were undertaken. reducing the population, and that seems to me to be the path that we're on now.
Well, that's certainly a point well taken, and I appreciate your perspective on that, because I know we've had a number of discussions about how globalism is going to be applied, and that certainly makes a lot of sense. What you just said. One of the things that is at the very center of globalism is the elimination of national borders and the elimination of physical barriers to prevent populations from being able to virtually go wherever they want. That is something that we've seen wholesale under Bush and Clinton and Obama. And it's obvious that this is a program that is being implemented, and we need to stop it in any way that we can if we want to survive as a nation. Debbie, talk to our listeners about the Western Governors Conference group and some of the statements that you heard about how they want to promote regionalism.
Yeah, you can go to Western Governors Association. I think it's WGA, WesternGovernorsAssociation.com, and see what they're up to. The last two conferences, they've had Ryan Zinke, Department of Interior Ryan Zinke, as their one of their keynote speakers. They do this conference twice a year, and whether it's the sage grouse or now wildfires or range management, it is a conference, or it is an organization of the Western governors, including territories. So I think that there are 20 states and territories that are included in the meetings. And I have never witnessed Jerry Brown, my governor, going, or Kate Brown Jerry Brown of California and Kate Brown of Oregon going to these meetings. But it is definitely Idaho that's well represented, Hawaii now, Colorado, Wyoming. Steve Bullock has been to many of the meetings in Montana. Dan, you're from Montana, Arizona, and others. They always invite either the Director of Ag or the Secretary of the Interior. Sally Jewell was there one year. Gina McCarthy was there one year in recent years. So they try and bring people together, the left and the right, if you will, the red and the blue together, to create policy, to influence policy. And their most recent attempt has been to push for more state ownership, like California ownership of its land. And the concern that I have for this is we already know by history, by their past moves, that they believe that zoning and land policy should be created around biodiversity, not around the right for a human to own land that is in, let's say, a water resource area. For example, what ranchers used to do, smart ranchers used to do in history is, like Malheur, for example, Dan and Michael. I recently went to Malheur, which they talked about at the most recent Western Governors webinar, which was all about collaborative federalism and what collaborative federalism can do for preserving wetlands, for example. And they gave the example of Malheur. But let me tell you a little bit about Malheur. Malheur used to be a series of ranches. And because these ranches needed water and they needed grazable land for their cattle, which cattle, by the way, there is no vegan or vegetarian in modern day society. I'm sorry, guys, whether you don't eat meat for health reasons or you think that you're saving planet Earth by, not using animals, or you think that you're being humane by not using livestock or animal byproducts, everything you're touching right now is brought to you by livestock. Everything is trucked to you. For example, the lubricants in a truck so all your produce, all your vegetables get to the store via a vehicle, a train of some sort, an airplane, a big rig. All those things use lubricants that come from the fatty tissues of livestock. It is the most natural form. That cow is an amazing animal. Livestock are amazing animals. They provide food and all sorts of things, sheetrock, insulation, even that beautiful Louis Vuitton bag that people carry around that costs them thousands of dollars to make them look good, that is livestock byproduct. So you may not put it down your throat, but by golly, you are using livestock right now. And yet these people want to hate on cattle, these environmentalists who think, oh, Malheur, yay for Malheur. Well, getting back to Malheur, because cattle ranching at one time was seen as a good thing, which I believe it is having parents who are cattle ranchers and know how they maintain and steward the land so excellently, that the Malheur was a series of cattle ranches. And how did they create these cattle ranches? Well, they created dams, dikes, diversions, and they used the water in the Malheur Valley, the Blitzen Valley, to create lakes, storage lakes. And then they moved the water to create, and timbered wherever they did timber. And now what you see is a Pacific Flyway that's protected. I think it's like 800,000 acres protected, owned now by the federal government under Teddy Roosevelt, who created a hunt club. He was all about hunting and conservation for his friends. And what did Zinke describe himself as? Teddy Roosevelt. Well, you look around at all these national parks and these wildlife refuges, and you go back into the history, and the majority of them were once ranches. They were once cattle ranches. And now, and because they planted poplar and they planted cottonwood and all these perchable trees, and they diverted water and dammed up water, then willows started to grow. And you have bugs and all these species come in. Why? Because somebody created a cattle ranch. So with the Western Governors Association and their big push is on public land. So the big push is, and there's the big argument out there, and this has shown up in the Bundy case, the Cliven Bundy family and Ammon Bundy, and the Malheur event that killed our friend's husband, where he was murdered. Lavoy Finicum was murdered by the FBI because they had to stop the spread of the disease, is what Kate Brown said, and ordered the murder. Somebody ordered the murder under the Obama administration of Lavoy Finicum. Now, if it seems like I'm going in a big round circle, it all connects. It all connects to land use and private property use. And whose power do we have? If you own private property, are you now just a renter to the federal government and the state government that tells you what you can and cannot do under the Endangered Species Act or the Clean Water Act or the Clean Air Act? No, that land is yours. And if you have a Lloydal title, like Michael would tell you, you own that land from what, Michael, the core of the earth to as high as you can see? Right, Michael?
That's correct. You're very right.
So what the Western Governors Association says that it's up to right now is collaborative governance, and you can look up collaborative governance because that is a term that they use, collaborative governance, in this most recent webinar. But they also say that they are up for giving, there's a bill that's in the Senate right now, and they say that they support this bill. It is S.2078, and it is both Republicans, a Republican, Mitch McConnell, and Schumer, who approve of this bill. And when you have in this, I think, political state, when you have a radical lefty like Schumer and a moderate lefty like Mitchell, I would be very concerned about this bill that says, I know we're going to break.
We're going into break. Debbie, hold that thought until we get on the other side of the break. We've got plenty of time to make that point.
Serving the planet. The Micro Effect. www.themicroeffect.com.
And we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings. For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means for expanding its sphere of influence.
It was 1776 when the founders signed the writ of independence from the Brits. It was revolution. Now an enemy from within would enslave us all again and deprive us of our rights in the Constitution. Restore the Republic.
Well, welcome back to Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel. And today we are doing a program with Michael Shaw and Debbie Boscalupi on the New World Order and the replacing of local elected governments with regional governments that are staffed by unelected, appointed bureaucrats. And it's important to note that these bureaucrats are usually from a non-governmental organization or tax-exempt foundation that have been appointed because of their particular environmental or radical leftist perspective. And they're usually, it's a stacked deck. With this group of people, you rarely find someone that's appointed to one of these positions that is a constitutionalist. I would say it's virtually impossible that happens. But before we get back into our discussion and really give this the thought that we need, I want to mention how important it is for our listeners to support this radio network and support the programs and the sponsors that we have, because it's so important that we keep this program and others like it on the air. And we have a terrific group of hosts on this network. We are in the process of getting a satellite uplink in position that would literally cover all of North America. And I know that the station manager, the network manager, Joe McNeil, is in the process right now of working with several other networks to expand our coverage to other affiliates all over North America, and some are located in other countries around the world. So if you want this kind of programming and you want this information to get out, it's important that you financially support this network and the group of people who are trying to make this happen. So with that, I'll return to the conversation. Debbie, you were partway through that thought. Let's finish it up with Schumer and McConnell. I think we both recognize, certainly probably most of the listeners recognize, that we have a one-party system that pretends to be a two-party system, and they just take turns playing good cop, bad cop, and meanwhile they just move us that much closer to the New World Order.
Yeah, exactly, and it's Senate Bill 2078 of the 115th Congress. And here's the title of it: Advancing Conservation and Education Act. Advancing Conservation and Education Act. And what they're suggesting is that the states are, within the states are national parks, and which the federal government, supposedly owns. And as Michael Shaw said earlier, the federal government has limited and defined powers, and one of them is not to own beautiful landscapes all across the state. And so what this bill proposes is that the Department of Interior and the BLM can now give parcels under this bill to people. And but to me, if the government can now give you land, they can take it back. So why are we even toying around with the federal government now saying, the Senate now saying, oh yeah, well, here's a parcel, we'll give it to you under Department of Interior Secretary. He will delegate which parcels are available for sale or to give back. What system of governance is that, or of government? It was supposed to be up to Congress. Well, anyway, the Senate is part of the Congress. So to delegate land, and they had already delegated land way back. Congress shall delegate the land, and they did. But the federal government has swooped in, taken over through all kinds of regulations, pushed people out of areas, and it is now they're using this thing called collaborative governance in order to say, oh yeah, the consensus says these dams should be removed. But you talk to the people in the local area, and they would tell you, wait a minute, those are our dams. And like you mentioned, Dan, we the people, the true stakeholders in the area, are being ignored. Our science does not fit their agenda, and so our facts do not fit their agenda. And therefore, under a collaborative governance system, it is much like democracy, a mob rule, and that is what regionalism is.
Right, that's exactly what it is, and that's one of the reasons that we're having this conversation today, because Michael, you and Debbie both, but Michael, you've actually had a number of legal lawsuits against the Association of Bay Area Governments and some of the programs that are promoting this regionalism. So I want to get you back into the conversation, because it's important that people realize what's going on in the San Francisco Bay Area is a precursor for what they want to do to our entire nation.
Well, that's right. It's really a plot to transform the San Francisco Bay Area into a political region. I mean, that's their own characterization. It's a plan that is largely unknown by the residents who live here. It's overwhelmingly opposed by the few who do know about it. The global boilerplate program called One Bay Area, or Planned Bay Area, will, as you say, roll out across the nation on a grand scale once it gets implemented here. The plan involves more than $250 billion of taxpayer money to redesign the San Francisco Bay Area. The plan destroys rural and suburban lifestyles. It transforms areas into huge, dense megacities where people are to be assessed, monitored, and controlled. You see, the plan for the creation of these super mega cities across the country is really rooted in a program called Council of Governments. Now, Council of Governments has a fairly innocuous beginning, although it wasn't really at all innocuous. Dwight Eisenhower formed them in order to circumvent the Constitution, which gave the federal government no authority for building a national road system. There's no power given to Congress or the federal government to create the interstate highway system. And so in the 1950s, when Eisenhower wanted to do that, Congress created what's called councils of governments. It seemed innocuous at the time. It was merely a funding mechanism for getting monies out to the state, federal monies, to build the federal interstate highway system. But that created the nexus for a unelected little power focus within every area of the country to be formed, funded by the federal government, and moved in whatever direction the federal government wanted it to move in. Over the decades, the power of the cause has grown and grown. The awareness of cause hasn't grown at all. It's not covered in your 8th grade civics book, for instance. And what's happened is that over these decades, cause has gained a massive amount of power, and not to be unexpected by citizens of America. the San Francisco Bay Area called ABAG, the Association of Bay Area Governments, was selected to do the charter plan for COGS when it comes to local government. And what's happening now in the San Francisco Bay Area is that this COG has created this $250 billion plan to restructure the roads and the housing system, the transportation system for the people of the Bay Area. And what they plan to do, what they have been doing, is that the One Bay Area plan calls for all residential development over the next 40 years to be multifamily development. No single-family housing is to be allowed in these 100 cities that are members of the ABAG Association. So the plan is to build multifamily housing, 80% of which must be located within half a mile of a public transit center. These public transit centers are being built here and there around the Bay, where buses and rails are to be the centerpiece of all future transportation. So they want everyone living in stack and pack housing within walking distance to these transit centers, so that all people can be transported through public transportation means. Well, this is the plan for the whole country. It's not just the Bay Area. The Bay Area is just the first to do it. So where they are now is they have their plan. They've gotten 101 cities out of 101 cities in the 9-county Bay Area region to adopt the zoning that satisfies ABAG. In other words, ABAG has bribed every city in the Bay Area with a total of $16 billion for the simple task of changing their zoning so their zoning conforms to the ABAG requirement, which means all stack and pack, and with these transportation centers being the centerpiece of that stack and pack development pattern. $16 billion have been given to the city for changing their zoning ordinance. So every city here now has zoning ordinances that require this kind of development. Well, regional government is promulgated through these councils of government. And the regional government systems serve to neuter local government through a federalized system of carrots and sticks. COGS are designed to be the engine to advance Agenda 21 at the local level. The plan in San Francisco, like I say, is the prototype of what COGS throughout the country. You have a COG wherever you live, and that COG will copy what we do here in the Bay Area, assuming that what we're attempting to do here transpires. And it's on its way to doing that. Now, Rosa Corey and I filed a lawsuit against ABAG in 2014. We promptly lost at trial in Oakland, California, to a decision that made no sense. I mean, the judge issued a tentative order. It was nonsensical. We argued that at oral hearing. He changed his decision radically and came up with an equally nonsensical reason for substantiating the efforts of this unelected group called ABAG to take over all cities and all county governmental responsibility for the planning and development of the Bay Area. Well, we then appealed the case. We had all the filings, all the briefs done 2.5 years ago, and the court has done absolutely nothing. ABAG's having a fit over the lack of action by the courts, because their program is largely stymied at this point by the lawsuits. It's hard to figure what the California appellate courts are doing with the case. It's been 2.5 years fully briefed with no word coming out of the courts other than a denial of the request by ABAG to drop the lawsuit, claiming that the circumstances have changed. And the court, ignored that request intends, they say, to issue an opinion, but it's taking a very, very long time. Obviously, the court is quite disturbed by what and how is going to handle this whole dynamic.
Well, Michael, it flies in the face of private property, which is an absolute cornerstone of our republic, and it flies in the face of truly elected representative government, which is also a cornerstone of our system of government. And so it's interesting because I think you're right. They probably are really stymied in trying to figure out which way they're going to go.
Well, I think they are, and as they make that determination, it will really seal the fate for the United States, certainly for California. If California adopts this plan in the Bay Area, it is soon to follow. The COG in Los Angeles and the COG in San Diego is ready to take this plan and reproduce it for those areas, and at which time California will really be divided into three separate governing agencies, the COGs in those various large cities, controlling the population in the surrounding counties. And it's ironic that California is now being discussed in terms of being three states, divided into three states, and that would largely dovetail with the existing establishment of COGs in the state. So you can see the plan is moving forward in a very coordinated and silent way, because I'll tell you, no newspaper has in years written a single report on COGs. And there's a reason for that. It's our newspapers are controlled by monoliths that are globalist in orientation. In the San Francisco Bay Area, virtually all the newspapers are owned by an outfit in Chicago, and they all print the same thing. It's the Bay Area News Group, and globalist is sure as heck, and they hide the COG operations. The public's unaware of it. Radio stations have not been brave enough to expose to the public the nature of this COG and the very revolutionary approaches it's taking to governance here in California. And so the public, largely a liberal voting public, is mostly unaware of these activities, and I think that even the most liberal of my friends would be appalled if they knew what the COGs were up to and how the legislators are going along with it. In California, the COGs are largely made up of elected officials who are chosen and appointed based upon their political allegiance to this globalist idea. So the worst of your politicians, if you live in California, probably sit on the COG, but they don't tell you about it. They don't tell you about the COG. They don't tell you about their activities. So we're really being overthrown by a silent coup in this country. The American people need to simply wake up to and turn out. It ought to be easy enough to turn out a COG. I think we got frustrated with the lack of public awareness and the lack of ability to be able to cause the public to become aware without the help of the press. You're kind of lost. I mean, a free press, an active press is important, and I think we've lost that in this country. And so consequently, for a lot of people, when they hear this information, they're somewhat astounded and really unbelievable of the dire nature of the circumstances that we present. We are being overtaken and overrun by a force that's right in our midst, and we're blind to it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're right.
I'd like to add to that, if I could, Dan, about ABAG, the Association of Bay Area Government. When you look up abag.ca.gov, you will see that they talk about, it's abag.ca.gov, they talk about collaborative partnerships. In other words, public-private partnerships with supposed stakeholders. And as Michael could fully tell you, when they talk about we want the planning to be local, it's a farce. It is a lie, because we had in the visioning meetings that there were many over a couple of years for this One Bay Area Plan 2040 plan, which was to regionalize us, where we share all resources. And then if your city or your county shares resources with the next county, and you have one blanket, one-size-fits-all plan, which is federalism, by the way, not dual federalism, but that is collaborative federalism, is one-size-fits-all. We showed up in numbers at these meetings, and there were many. And we outnumbered, the people who oppose the One Bay Area Plan and are for private property rights and are for a transparent government and believe that the public should know and understand what was happening to the Bay Area, which is where they dictate where you can live, whether or not you can have a single family home, what kind of home you can build along a public development area, or if you're in a priority conservation area or priority development area, priority conservation area. If you're in a priority conservation area, you cannot build. You are limited as to, if you can, you're very limited. So we showed up in numbers, and using what we identified as the Delphi technique, we were shut down. So here you have people showing up saying, wait, this is my local neighborhood. I want to say, they ignored us, they pushed us out, they made fun of us. This is not about locals showing up and saying, this is what I want for my area. This is about consensus and fake data and fake numbers and money and greed. And the ABAG is part of a collaborative governance system, which was ABAG, the Association of Bay Area Government, the MPO, the Metropolitan, or MPO or MPO, Michael, you could correct me, Metropolitan Planning Organization, MPO, BART, Bay Area Rapid Transit, and then BAQ, MMD, whatever that is, Bay Area Quality Management District, I missed the number in there, Air Quality Manager, BAAQMD. All those groups are collaborating with the Sierra Club, an NGO, to say what the future of the Bay Area is, to say what the future of Los Angeles is. And the trouble with the Los Angeles region is it overlaps into Mexico. So they have an issue there. How do we open the borders that now the region overlaps into Mexico? Or if you're in the state of Washington, in the Cascadia region, how do we erase the borders that now that region overlaps into Canada? And all of this gets back to, as Michael had mentioned, control. And the idea behind this big agenda is to, and we know this, is to force rural America through regulation, fines, fees, making it nearly impossible for them to own land or even, graze or tillage their land, and making it nearly impossible, removing hydroelectric facilities. You look at all the fires burning. What is that doing? And then also the agenda that I went to the I went to a couple conferences, one in Australia called Eco Cities, and then another one in Malaysia, the United Nations Habitat 9 conference. And with people like Jerry Brown and Al Gore, with representatives from the California government at these big meetings held outside of the United States, saying that by the year 2050, over 80% of the world's population is going to be living in cities. So we have to build up the cities, because that's where all the food is going to be, where the jobs are going to be. You're going to be able to bike, take public transportation, or walk everywhere you go, because that's what it means to be local and save planet Earth. all of these major meetings, including the Paris Agreement, which we're not out of, even though Trump keeps going around and saying we're out of it, we're not out of the Paris Agreement. We are in it until the day after the next U.S. presidential election in 2020. Why? Because they needed to safeguard the Paris Agreement just in case we did get a conservative president, which we did, or I think we did, in the United States, so that Paris Agreement, which they're now ramping up, I've heard it's the Paris Agreement on steroids, so that just in case, the United States backed out, that there would be a safeguard that we could possibly be put back in for good forever. And this election, whether you like Trump or not, this upcoming election is super important. And this current election in 2018 is super important. If we lose the House, they impeach the president, I think we're in. Just as Michael Shaw has been predicting for years, Dan, you've been predicting for years, the United States is on the brink of losing its freedom and liberty forever. And this is why I think that the three of us and many, many others continue to try and educate the world, wake them up, as Michael Shaw had said earlier, so that our future is secure in freedom and liberty.
Absolutely. We're moving into a break, but Debbie will pick that thought up on the other side, and I want to talk with Michael about just exactly how these cogs are created and staffed. So we'll pick that up on the other side of the break.
Serving the planet. The Micro Effect. www.themicroeffect.com.
You take the blue pill. The story ends. You wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to believe. You take the red pill. You stay in Wonderland. And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
There was a mighty nation, blessed above all of creation. It was a rare and precious pearl, conceived in faith and liberty, home of the brave, land of the free. It was the envy of the world. But this shining city on a hill has turned from the Creator's will and let evil take control. Now the reckless men who lead them want to strip away their freedom and to steal their very soul. Now it's smoke and mirrors, switching bait, criticize and confiscate and let the guilty walk away. In this once righteous, godly nation, in the halls of education, they forbid a child to pray. They say we need to spread the wealth. They pretend to guard the health of the feeble and the poor, while the hand they hold behind their backs confuses and conceals the fact that the wolf is at the door. There's an unseen hand.
Well, welcome back to Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel, and today my guests on the radio show are Michael Shaw and Debbie Boscalupi, and we are talking about councils of government and how under the New World Order plan, local governments that are elected and representative of the local people will be replaced with unelected, bureaucratic regional governments, which will grow and grow in size until they're literally completely detached from local issues. And this is straight out of the Communist Manifesto. If people listening to this program don't believe that this will ever be a reality, it is a reality. It is happening in America as we speak. And as a former county commissioner, I saw it happen in the most rural counties of Montana, which is a very rural state. And I can tell you there are forces in our country today who are promoting this regionalism at an unexpected level. I mean, I wouldn't have dreamed that they would have the traction that they have. And a small town like Bozeman, Montana, which is a 50,000 person community, and incidentally, it's one of the ICLEI cities, so is Missoula and Helena in Montana. They are now doing the kind of housing that Michael and Debbie have been talking about, and that is stack and pack housing. They are building 3 to 5 story buildings with commercial enterprises on the first floor and residential units above those, so that people won't have to drive, won't have to go anywhere to go to work. They literally can just walk downstairs, which, you know, frankly, in some ways, that's not a bad idea, but it shouldn't be something that's forced on the American public. And incidentally, these communities and these buildings in a small town like Bozeman, Montana, they have no provision for private parking, but they do have provision for bicycles in front of the building, and they literally front right on the street, and they were never intended to have private vehicles as part of that plan. When I was fortunate enough to be included as a national delegate at the Republican Convention in Cleveland 2 summers ago, which nominated President Trump as the delegate for the Republican Party, I saw travel throughout Cleveland, and there's literally mile after mile after mile of 3 to 5 story brand new buildings with commercial enterprises on the lower floors and residential units above them. And most of those complexes were not even being occupied. They were so new, and the concept was so new that they were unoccupied, and literally mile after mile of them. So it's happening all over our country, and that's where we're at on this. So, Debbie, did you want to finish your thoughts on that? And then I'd like to get Michael in the discussion about how these cogs are put together.
Well, I would like to say that back to collaborative governance, it is I've seen this example of dual federalism versus collaborative federalism, aka collaborative governance. And you take a piece of cake and you cut it in like a layered cake, and on a 2-layer cake, which is dual federalism, you see that there is a definitive line on that piece of cake, and one represents state government and the other represents federal government. And where and then the other analogy of dual federalism is a swirl cake. You don't see the delineation of powers. It's swirly. It's unclear. It's not what our founding fathers had intended. They wanted our government system to be crystal clear so that the federal government understood its limited and defined powers. And nowhere does it say in our Constitution, nowhere does it say that the federal government is supposed to be involved in private land or private land ownership or regulating private land ownership. And that's where we are now. And you could see that ABAG has even back in the 60s, or back when it was created, in the 60s and 70s, was dealing with the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA. They were starting to merge way back then, and now we see just this huge amount of power in groups like ABAG, COGS that Michael is sharing about, and this movement away from we the people who have the power. And that is my concern. I hope that after this radio show that people start looking up collaborative governance, cooperative government, cooperative agencies, which is what Lavoie Finicum was trying to alert us to when it came to the BLM and the overreaching power of these non-elected, self-appointed agencies that have been given what feels like unlimited power, whether it's on the ground or in the court system.
Great. Michael, let's talk about these councils of government and how this whole process is developed. And I know you and I have talked about this before in previous radio shows, but one of the things that come out of this, these COGs, these councils of government, is the so-called public-private partnership idea, which is nothing short of fascism. And it seems that the old saying goes, in private business, the cream rises to the top. In politics, the scum rises to the top. It seems like this is obviously a political process because there's an awful lot of scum on the top of these organizations.
Well, I think that's right. COGs are the ultimate threat to the American Republic. And it's very unfortunate that I know of no American political leader who will acknowledge that. I mean, in respect to the COGs, they've been, as I said earlier, they've been following along for the last number of decades, and now they are coming into a real fruition. And California is always a starting ground for things like this. And that's why people need to be continually suspect of everything that comes out of California. I think we've got someone who's going to be running for president, United States Senator Kamala Harris from California, and she's a full-fledged politico who's engaged in this kind of, you characterize it properly, fascist activity. Fascism is a combination of business with government for an end product. That's what Hitler did in Germany, and that's what the Bushes and the Obamas and the Clintons have been doing in the United States very successfully for the last 30 years, and it had its roots from well before that. And Woodrow Wilson certainly got the ball rolling with what we're seeing today in this new form of government. Now, COGs and ABAG have taken the lead in terms of how a COG is to operate, as I've indicated. And the ABAG organization was really birthed by the California legislature, who passed a bill called Senate Bill 375 about 10 years ago, that passed under Schwarzenegger. And that bill required the ABAG adopt a plan that, quote, will reduce greenhouse emissions from automobiles and light trucks. So we see that old talk from the last couple of decades coming into full light here with legislative demand that ABAG will reduce the greenhouse emissions. I guess that means we have to breathe less because that's the big greenhouse emitter. The problem begins there. So the legislative mandate of SB 375 is plain and unambiguous, but in our case, the trial court rewrote the legislative mandate to require only that the plan be reasonably expected to reduce greenhouse emissions to the target set out in the bill. Well, this reinterpretation of the direct language of the bill allows something closer to what ABAG has actually adopted. But ABAG even admits that Plan Bay Area will not meet the reduction in emissions target. ABAG engaged the services of an independent consultant named Economic and Planning Services to assess the feasibility of Plan Bay Area. And according to that feasibility report, the Bay Area falls well short of the statutory required greenhouse emission gas targets. So we ask in our court case, how is it that ABAG can make up its own plan in accordance with a Senate bill that it doesn't even comply with? What is the legal authority for ABAG to do everything it's doing when it's not following the crazy legislative scheme that Schwarzenegger put in front of it? Well, it's just the whole fact that government no longer does what it's supposed to do. It's out for its own power. It's out for its own identity. It's out for its own creation of this world government. You know, the advocates of the Planned Bay Area program put out by ABAC have actually said in various conferences that when ABAC is established fully the way they want it to be established, that then the San Francisco Bay Area will get its own seat at the United Nations. That's their objective, is to become a city-state of the New World Order. And they say that once LA adopts its plan, and the organization is called SCAG, once that adopts its Bay Area-like program, it too will have its own seat at the United Nations. As will San Diego when it teams up with Tijuana to form its own new COG-based government. It too will have its seat at the United Nations. What you can see is the whole fraying, not just of the state of California, but the plan for the fraying and the city-making of all of America as part of the UN directed team that eventually ends up in world government. So it's critical that people understand COG. You know, a good way for people to get basic information is to go to our website, the sister website of Freedom Advocates, that is Globalization of California. And there we follow this court case very closely, and the whole study of the nature of COGS. And I would recommend that your listeners go to Globalization of California, watch our regular updates, because the action is fast-moving. Even though the court case has been stymied, the action in respect to the development of the COG and the opposition of the COG is something that more and more citizens need to become aware of and become involved with it, because it's maybe a dream, but it's a dream that can be brought to life. The American people can control the American government, but not as long as unelected, unaccounted members of COG take control of our finances, take control of our municipal planning, and take control of our very lives. We must remember that as we talk about the globalization of everywhere, meaning put all the people together in stack and pack units in small geographic areas and restrict their freedom of mobility, you have people then that are really captured populations which can be easily reduced by gross numbers. And remember, in that pursuit, the guiding document of Agenda 21 calls for a reduction of human population by 85%. So you cannot not view the actions of the movements of these centralizing forces. You can't remove the end objective of the actions they're taking today, because they tie together. And the idea of stack and pack and jamming everybody together, getting people out of the countryside, is exactly what they want to do in order to be able to easily and massively reduce human population.
Yeah, that's right. That's absolutely right. Michael, you referred to this as the planner's dream, but the inverse of that is the citizen's nightmare. And what we're seeing in all these plans is something that, Debbie, you brought up to the conversation, that they use is outside organizations who are very political, usually environmental or some other, let's say, axe to grind, or some kind of a special interest, who are in charge, who are the facilitators of these various meetings, and they use the Delphi technique to control the direction of the meeting and then force people into a consensus of ideas. And that's something that I've seen myself. There's a technique to it. Frankly, local governments are extremely lazy, and they're more than happy to allow some outside facilitator who's being paid by a non-governmental organization or a tax-exempt foundation to come in and run these meetings. And it's because they are supposedly better trained and more knowledgeable about the issues. And in fact, that's right. They are better trained and more knowledgeable about the issues, but the issues are taking away local control. The issues are handing government over to unelected bureaucrats and to people who want to control the whole process and move us into this new world order. Debbie, what do you think of that?
Well, of course, I agree with all of that, and I hate to keep driving this home, but as I look up collaborative governance, I looked up collaborative governance and COGS just now, and although I don't see COGS in here, which I'm sure I will be able to find it, I do want to say under kitchentable.org, I found the definition of collaborative governance. Let me just go back to say about the One Bay Area plan and what Michael had said earlier. If people knew about the plan, they would not want it. I don't know very many who would want a reorganization, a fundamental transformation of our lives, the dictation of where you live, what you drive, what you eat, where you work, how you can get to your work, and the monitoring, surveilling of things like smart meters that control your every single move. If they decide that you're using too much energy or too much water under a smart water meter, then they can either fine you, regulate you, or even shut you off. But here's from kitchentable.org. So one, to say, if people knew about the plan, as Michael said, they would not want this plan. This is what it says about collaborative governance. The term under kitchentable.org, the term collaborative governance refers to a relatively new and emerging field, and thus academics, practitioners, and participants engage in discussions on how to best define a collaborative governance. Here's a collaborative governance definition in its table. The process of facilitating and operating in multi-organizational arrangements to solve problems that cannot be solved or solved easily by single organizations. The process and structure of public policy decision-making and management that engage people constructively across the boundaries of public agencies, levels of government, and or the public, private, and civic spheres in order to carry out a public purpose that could not otherwise be accomplished. In other words, the One Bay Area plan, if it was transparent, if Plan Bay Area, if the 2040 plan or the Tri-Cities plan, wherever you are, or the Tri-Regional plan, or wherever it is, in Denver, it's Dr. Cog, wherever it is, where they're trying to regionalize us through this thing called collaborative governance. If you knew their intended goals and plans, you would not want it. So why do they use collaborative governance? To push policy through that otherwise could not get through. Why couldn't it get through? Because people don't want it. People don't want this future. And if they knew about it, which they don't in the masses, if they knew about it, then I think people would be, showing up to meetings and trying to and running for office and trying to take back their local government.
Well, it's just the case. I'm sorry, Dan. I was just going to say it's the case that the American founding was designed to make government difficult to operate. That keeps government getting too big. That was the purpose of our founders. Make a government where the coordination is not easy. You don't have a dictator who just commands what's to be done. It's a process that divides between state, federal, and local. And once we start combining federal, state, and local through federal coordinations, you end up with an oligarchy, a dictatorship in effect. You don't have the balances that our founders presented to us to keep government in America from ever getting too big. And now the forces behind government are working to consolidate us under these principles that Debbie's talking about, that is in complete defiance of the American intended form of government. And that's what we have to fight hardest.
Well, absolutely, and people need to understand that under our founders' vision of government, government was only to exist to protect the rights of the people, to protect the rights of the individual, and that's something that we no longer have. So,
well, particularly with COG actions. I mean, the COGs make individual rights an irrelevant notion, a forgotten notion. And that's why COGs have to be silently imposed on the people, because the people in America are born to appreciate the idea of individual rights. Even some of the self-called collectivists, are very protective of their own individual rights. They just don't care about the guy next door, and they want to take control of that as well. And that's what we have to fight against. And, the best way to fight that is to get rid of COGs. That's a big battle. But if we don't take it on, if we don't win it, we're all losers.
Absolutely. Well, we will pick this conversation up on the other side of the break, and this has been a fascinating discussion. Please stay with us, because the last half hour of this program, we will give you information on how you can do battle with these groups.
Serving the planet. The Micro Effect. www.themicroeffect.com.
There was a lawyer once. His name was Francis Scott Key. He penned a song that I'm sure you're aware of. You've seen it. It's in most hymnals throughout our churches. It's called the National Anthem. It is our song as an American. We go, however, to a ball game. We stand in our church services and we sing the words of that song, and they float over our minds and our lips, and we don't even realize what we're singing. Most of us have memorized it as a child, but we've never really thought about what it means. Let me tell you a story. Francis Scott Key was a lawyer in Baltimore. The colonies were engaged in vicious conflict with the mother country, Britain. Because of this conflict and the protractedness of it, they had accumulated prisoners on both sides. The American colonies had prisoners and the British had prisoners. And the American government initiated a move. They went to the British and they said, let us negotiate for the release of these prisoners. They said, we want to send a man out to discuss this with you. They were holding the American prisoners in boats about 1,000 yards offshore. And they said, we want to send a man by the name of Francis Scott Key. He will come out and negotiate to see if we can make a mutual exchange. On the appointed day, in a rowboat, he went out to this boat and he negotiated with the British officials. And they reached a conclusion that men could be exchanged on a one-for-one basis. Francis Scott Key, jubilant with the fact that he'd been successful, went down below in the boats, and what he found was a cargo hold full of humanity, men. And he said, men, I've got news for you tonight. You're free. He said, tonight I have negotiated successfully your return to the colonies. He said, you'll be taken out of this boat, out of this filth, out of your chains. As he went back up on board to arrange for their passage to the shore, the admiral came and he said, we have a slight problem. He said, we will still honor our commitment to release these men, but it'll be merely academic after tonight. It won't matter. And Francis Scott Key said, what do you mean? He said, well, Mr. Key, he said, tonight we have laid an ultimatum upon the colonies. Your people will either capitulate and lay down the colors of that flag that you think so much of, or you see that fort right over there, Fort Henry? He said, we're going to remove it from the face of the earth. He said, how are you going to do that? He said, if you will, scan the horizon of the sea. And as he looked, he could see hundreds of little dots. And he said, that's the entire British war fleet. He said, all of the gunpowder, all of the armament is being called upon to demolish that fort. It will be here within striking distance in a matter of about 2.5 hours. He said, the war is over. These men would be free anyway. He said, you can't shell that fort. He said, that's a large fort. He said, it's full of women and children. He says, it's predominantly not a military fort. They said, don't worry about it. They said, we've left them a way out. And he said, what's that? He said, do you see that flag way up on the rampart? He said, we have told them that if they will lower that flag, the shelling will stop immediately. And we'll know that they've surrendered, and you'll now be under British rule. Francis Scott Key went down below and told the men what was about to happen. And they said, how many ships? He said, hundreds. The ships got closer. Francis Scott Key went back up on top and he said, men, I'll shout down to you what's going on as we watch. As twilight began to fall, and as the haze hung over the ocean as it does at sunset, suddenly the British war fleet unleashed. He says the sound was deafening. There were so many guns that there were no reliefs. He said it was absolutely impossible to talk or hear. He said suddenly the sky, although dark, was suddenly lit. And he says from down below, all he could hear the men, the prisoners, saying was, tell us where the flag is. What have they done with the flag? Is the flag still flying over the rampart? Tell us. 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours into the shelling, every time the bomb would explode and it would be close to the flag, they could see the flag in the illuminated red glare of that bomb. And Francis Scott Key would report down to the men below, it's still up. It's not down. The admiral came and he said, your people are insane. He said, what's the matter with them? He said, don't they understand this is an impossible situation? Francis Scott Key said he remembered what George Washington had said. He said the thing that sets the American Christian apart from all other people in the world is he will die on his feet before he'll live on his knees. The admiral said, we have now instructed all of the guns to focus on the rampart to take that flag down. He said, we don't understand something. Our reconnaissance tells us that that flag has been hit directly again and again and again, and yet it's still flying. We don't understand that. But he said, now we're about to bring every gun for the next 3 hours to bear on that point. Francis Scott Key said the barrage was unmerciful. All that he could hear was the men down below praying. The prayer, God, keep that flag flying where we last saw it. Sunrise came. He said there was a heavy mist hanging over the land, but the rampart was tall enough. There stood the flag, completely nondescript, in shreds. The flagpole itself was at a crazy angle, but the flag was still at the top. Francis Scott Key went aboard and immediately went into Fort Henry to see what had happened. And what he'd found had happened was that that flagpole and that flag had suffered repetitious direct hits. And when it had fallen, but men, fathers, who knew what it meant for that flag to be on the ground, although knowing that all of the British guns were trained on it, walked over and held it up humanly until they died. Their bodies were removed and others took their place. Francis Scott Key said what held that flagpole in place at that unusual angle were patriots' bodies. He penned the song, "Oh, say can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming? Or the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that the flag was still there. Oh, say, does that star-spangled banner yet fly and wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave?" The debt was demanded. The price, it was paid.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rockets red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say, does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave? Oh, say, does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave?
Well, welcome back to Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel. We had that interlude. I guess what we need to tell our listeners is, you know, it's time for those kind of patriots to come forward. It's time for our country to understand that we are in a fight to the death, and we are in a fight against the forces of evil that want to destroy our great republic. And our founding fathers and many of the people who were our forefathers lost their lives to protect this great nation, and we cannot slouch into socialism and world government because of the stupidity and the ignorance of Americans who think that somehow a little bit of socialism is a good thing. There's no such thing as a little bit of socialism. All there is a lot of oppression, and As Maggie Thatcher famously said, the problem with socialism is that sooner or later you run out of other people's money. And the fact is that it's an unsustainable, we talk about sustainable development. Socialism is an unsustainable political system, and we need to understand that freedom and the American system of constitutional republic and self-reliance is what this world needs. So anyway, I'm sorry for the long interlude there. Michael, did you want to finish up with the discussion of how we can do battle against the councils of government?
Well, I have a couple of ideas that people might consider. First, at Globalization of California, we have a letter in the article section people might want to review. It's a letter that we drafted in June of 2016, and we sent it to Donald Trump in his campaign. We sent a follow-up letter once he was elected. It all addresses the issue of COGS and the threats COGS pose, and asking for his assistance. Now, to my knowledge, we've attempted, but to my knowledge, I can't say that the right people ever saw it. I presume they did and simply didn't respond. But if there's anybody in the listening audience who has a way to get this letter affirmed to be at the president's desk and responded to by the administration, that could serve us all very well. If Trump gets on board in respect to the issue of COGS, that's certainly something that anybody in the listening audience can, if they've got some contacts there, could join in and be of great assistance. For everybody, I think, though, that if they were to study globalization of California and these issues presented by COGS and issues we've raised in the lawsuit and the status of the lawsuit, that would be beneficial just because if people began to understand this issue, we will go a long ways toward resolving it. And I think we've done a good job of setting these things out, globalization of California. So study it first, and then secondly, start to fight against your COG. There is a COG where you live, and they're sitting in wait until they can launch the kind of action that's been taken by the COG in the San Francisco Bay Area. Don't think it's not coming where you live, coming sooner than you think. If you're in Los Angeles or San Diego, you're right on the doorstep of this. And, COGs hold their meetings, except in a couple places around the country, people don't show up. If you show up, it makes a big difference. And if we show up in enough places, it'll make a winning difference. So get yourself familiar with your local COG, show up at their meetings, stun them, bring some other people with you, learn, and begin to raise points and debunk their plans. And, lots of progress will be made. And the next thing I would ask is that, our lawsuit, we're waiting for the appellate decision. If we win, the ABAG will appeal it to the California Supreme Court. And if we lose, we plan to appeal it to the Supreme Court ourselves. And so we can certainly use financial assistance to keep this ball in the air, because if we lose or if we abandon our effort and the COGs float in and take over the Bay Area, that's the beginning of a very fast downward slide. And I would ask that we all join in to fight against that.
Well, that's a good point, Michael. And people need to understand that, this is not something that you can afford to sit back and let other people do the heavy lifting. We are at a point in our nation's history and in the survival of our republic where every single able-bodied person needs to get and be involved. And I have to tell our listeners, please go look up the Delphi technique. There's some great articles on that on the internet so that you understand when you go to these meetings where there are councils of government or BLM or any number of other agencies promoting these concepts, that you understand the process and how facilitators are brought into the process to control the direction of the meeting and to control the outcome of the meeting. And these people are professionals. You need to understand what you're up against. So please go to The Delphi Technique. Look it up. There's a great article on there that at least it used to be on the internet that Phyllis Schlafly wrote, and excellent definition, description of how the Delphi technique is used to control and run meetings where this kind of activity is happening. Debbie, you've done a terrific amount of work on this. You really understand this whole process. I'd love to give you the last word on what needs to happen in America to turn this ship of state around.
Yeah, and before I go there, I'd love to also mention Rosa Kore's website has a good description of the Delphi technique as brought to us as under the One Bay Area Plan, the Association of Bay Area Government, and her website is Democrats Against UNAgenda21.com. Democrats Against UNAgenda21.com. Yes, even some Democrats are against these atrocious and I would say pure evil plan to control, monitor, and surveil our every move. And, for people who, I often get people in disbelief and on that, there are people who want to control our every move. But you know what? Solomon said there's nothing new under the sun. And we survived dictatorship. As a modern day society, our founding fathers fled tyrannical rule. They fled government that was out of control. They fled kingdoms. And this plan under the 21st century, and it is called UN Agenda 21 Sustainable Development, is about controlling our every move in order to save planet Earth from human beings. And I would say, Dan, that these anti-human humans, because they are human who are pushing this, but they are anti-human. They are for themselves, I would say, and anti-human. And I can quote David Brower in a book called Population Bomb, done by Paul Ehrlich, who believes that the world should be depopulated with people like you and me who would steward the land. He believes that there are two types of people. David Brower, who started Earth First, is one, the type of people who would take care of planet Earth, and then the rest, you and me, the rest who would pillage and rape it for all of its resources. Now, that's not a quote, but that is bottom line what he's trying to say. Daniel Webster told us that, he said, if all my possessions were taken from me with one exception, so of all my possessions, everything was taken from me, but with one exception, I would choose to keep the power of communication, for by it I would soon regain all the rest. I love that quote. He was telling us that your freedom of speech is key to preserving your freedoms and your liberties. It's key that we keep educating and communicating to try and wake up the masses, because the kingdom fears off with your head of the masses. That's what used to happen to kings when they were out of control. There were the masses of people who would fight back. And I agree with you, Dan and Michael, that we need people to fight back. Now's the time. Now's the time not to be the sunshine patriot, but to be the patriot who, no matter what the circumstances are, no matter what the environment is, that we are people who would rather die on our feet than live a day on our knees. And the first time I heard that quote, that I would rather die on my feet than live a day on my knees, is by my friend Mark Baird, who is leading the charge in the State of Jefferson movement. The State of Jefferson movement meaning part of what Michael referred to earlier is the three-state separation of California. But at that time, when we started this back in 1940s, we knew that rural America was being subjugated by urban America because the populations were in the urban areas. So therefore, rural America is being ousted by the voting population in urban areas, which urban areas need the rural areas more than the rural areas need the urban areas. And back to Daniel Webster and the freedom of speech, there is a new website started by all of our friends, Patrick Wood, who's the author of Technocracy Rising, technocracy.news. And his new website is to help us organize locally to fight back. It's called citizensforfreespeech.org, citizensforfreespeech.org, and I encourage everyone to go there, sign up, become a local activist. The other website that I would, besides Michael Shaw, freedomadvocates.org, that I would recommend is also Center for Self-Governance with Mark Purr, and take those courses on how to become a local activist, to take your local area back. And I agree with both of you that once we start taking back our local power, we can then move on to taking back our state and taking back this country to where the people are in power, not the federalists, not the people who believe in collaborative federalism and believe in a mixed match of governance where you can't even identify where you need to go to get your representative government. So Center for Self-Governance, freedomadvocates.org, Citizens for Free Speech, are the websites that I would recommend. And of course, supporting the Micro Effect, because the Micro Effect is one radio station that you could rely on 24 hours a day to get pertinent, useful, factual information. And we're also reaching out to people you might not even have heard of. Tomorrow I have a FBI whistleblower on my show right here at themicroeffect.com, 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. Pacific, so don't miss that.
Oh, absolutely. Debbie, I have to tell you, you make me proud to be an American, to have a fellow patriot like you on a radio station and on a network like the Micro Effect. And I recommend that our listeners please support this network, support our work, because we are the last line of defense to save this nation. Michael, I want to thank you for being a guest on our show. Is there anything else you would like to say before we go into the commercial break?
Well, I think we've covered it today. I just would encourage people to become aware of what's happening in California and take steps to prevent that same onslaught from happening in your state.
Okay, well, thank you both, and thank our listeners for joining us today, and always try to connect the dots. Thank you, and we'll see you again next week.